On the morning of April 3rd, 1967, before the sun could even warm the damn planks of the rail yard, signal electrician Carl Nyman opened a brown envelope on the Formica kitchen table in Coos Bay, Oregon, and realized, just from the Southern Pacific letterhead, that it was not ordinary mail. Inside was a folded map, marked in red along the alignment that climbed toward Eugene, following the Willamette Valley corridor and its junctions, and a short, direct, almost impersonal note: modernize sections for freight, reduce intermediate stops, convert signaling to accommodate longer, faster trains. There was a deadline. There was a materials list with stock codes and quantities, as if the change were merely a matter of logistics and the storeroom. But that year, behind that kind of paper, the same silent threat always arrived. Whoever did not adapt would be left behind, in an industry where highway competition and administrative decisions had already been squeezing the space for passengers. Carl held the letter longer than he needed to, because his work had always had an easy purpose to point to: keep people safe at crossings and stations, prevent one train from catching another, make sure someone waiting in the cold could cross to the other side without becoming a statistic. Now the order spoke of freight, tonnage, efficiency, shorter headways between consists, and less time wasted on stops. What was disappearing from the map was not only stopping points. It was part of the reason to get up before dawn. And if he made a wrong adjustment in the name of speed, the cost would fall on someone who did not even know his name. That same day, Ruth counted the price of milk and turned down the radio when she heard that another passenger service would be reevaluated in the Northwest. The house smelled of brewed coffee and wet wood, with the cold air typical of the coast and moisture coming in through the cracks. Carl slipped the envelope into his leather folder, beside the black-covered maintenance notebook with pages stained by oil and coffee, and left while the fog was still dropping from the estuary. The 1961 Ford F-100 pickup had its bed full of boxes: track relays, coils, signal lamps, terminals, rolls of wire, and a portable oscilloscope the company had bought at the end of 1966, which he treated as if it were too fragile for Oregon's world of gravel, mud, and rain. The radio reception was poor, but between static and country music, it was still possible to catch news about Vietnam and protests in cities that seemed far away. In Carl's world, distance was measured differently. Miles of rail, wooden bridges over creeks that rose suddenly with rain, service access roads, grade crossings where asphalt met ballast, and the exact place where a mistake could become irreversible. In the chief signalman's office in Eugene on April 6th, the air smelled of carbon paper and tobacco, with ashtrays full and stacks of typed forms. The boss, a middle-aged man with his tie loosened, pushed a clipboard forward and explained in the same voice he would use to ask for coffee: freight sections first. More trains, fewer stops. The instruction comes from above. He avoided proper names, as always, and stuck to what could be filed. What mattered were the numbers: MP 651, MP 673, signal points near Cresswell, Junction City, and farther south toward Roseburg. Carl knew those places through an intimate geography. The sound of wind passing the signal post, the texture of crushed gravel under his boot, the way rain collected in junction boxes and made rubber gaskets swell, oxidation appearing where sealing failed. He also knew the small platforms, sometimes only a rectangle of wood beside the line, where now and then someone boarded a passenger train with a light suitcase and a coat held tight to the chest, buying a paper ticket and waiting under lamps that did not always work. The first days were routine, and routine was what held the work together. He and the helper assigned for that season, Danny Kubiak, 22, drove stretches of U.S. Route 99, cutting onto secondary roads until they reached grade crossings and signal houses, following maintenance maps and mileage markers. Danny carried ladders, opened boxes carefully, wrote down serial numbers and installation dates, as internal records required. Carl tested circuits with an almost religious patience, measuring continuity, checking contacts, verifying power and return, and recording readings in the notebook. On April 12th, in Cresswell, they replaced an old relay with a newer model, with more reliable contacts to withstand increased traffic and constant vibration. A freight train passed while they were still tightening screws, and the ground shook with a weight that seemed to have doubled in recent years. Cars of wood and steel, some marked for lumber, others for grain, went on without end, couplers clanking and wheels singing on the rail. The engineer did not look down. He did not need to. The line belonged to him and to the timetable, and the timetable was what the company demanded. In Junction City, on a morning of April 20th, Carl saw the passenger platform with its worn boards and a crooked bench. There was no one there. The sign with the town's name was faded, and the lamp on the post had been out for months, the glass clouded and the socket marked by moisture. He remembered fixing that post on a night in December 1963, ice in his mustache and a flashlight strapped to his chest, because a woman had complained that you can't see the train step. Back then, the complaint came by phone or by forwarded note and became a work order. Now, the list of orders did not mention the lamp. It did mention increasing the reliability of the approach circuit to reduce the time the gate stayed down, because truck drivers were impatient and the company wanted neither lawsuits nor delay reports that turned into cost. The moral of the work had always been simple for Carl. Safety was a silent promise made to strangers. He did not know the people who crossed the line in Springfield or waited for a train in Cottage Grove, but he put his own body between them and error with a kind of discipline that did not show up in photographs. But in May 1967, that promise began to change shape, without fanfare, like a part shifting inside a machine that keeps running. On May 1st, in a meeting room in Eugene, an operations supervisor showed a map with circles crossed out. Passenger stops that don't justify cost. Service being reduced. The word passengers was spoken as if it were a category of money-losing freight, and the tone was accounting. Carl did not argue. It was not his nature, and he knew decisions like that came from levels where the field appeared only as a line on a chart. But in the parking lot, Danny remarked, without looking directly at him, the guy in the shop's dad used to take the train up to Portland. The sentence hung in the air like smoke, and the silence that followed seemed part of the same process of reduction. On May 9th, in Roseburg, it rained all day. The sound of rain on the tin roof of the signal house was continuous, like a distant train, and water ran down the corners where metal met wood. Carl opened the terminal box and found corrosion where it should have been dry, green verdigrease on the contacts, and pooled moisture. He cleaned it with a wire brush, applied insulating compound, tightened again, and checked the tightness like someone who knows vibration loosens what seems firm. Rain, time, and salt air from the coast were old adversaries, but now there was another adversary, less visible and more insistent: haste. The company wanted the section ready for the timber shipping season. There were contracts, customers' demands, and the expectation that the field would keep pace with the paper. Carl felt it as physical tension. Finish before the next train, before the next phone call, before the clock became an argument. It was on an afternoon of May 18th that the meaning of the work suffered its first visible rupture, in a place too small to stand out in daily life. They were at a point south of Cottage Grove, near a platform that had not received passengers for weeks. The station's sign, nailed to a simple structure, had peeling letters, and the wood showed marks of old rain. Carl climbed the ladder to change a signal lamp on an old mast. The signal served both block protection and approach indication at a rural crossing, and the lamp was part of what kept the warning legible in fog and late afternoon. Danny held the ladder. In the middle of the work, a car stopped on the other side, an old sedan with two women inside and a child in the back seat. They waited with the engine running, looking at the signal and at the men. When the gate rose, they drove through slowly and did not wave. It was not rudeness, it was fatigue. The road was theirs, but that place had a cold authority. The train always won. Carl climbed down and saw, on the empty platform, an old newspaper caught in a puddle. The headline spoke of fares and cuts, the letters blurred by water. He did not pick up the paper. He watched it come apart, as if it were a material summary of what was happening. At the end of May, the Modernization order hardened. A memorandum dated May 29th, 1967 instructed them to prioritize track circuits for increased capacity and reduce maintenance of non-essential assets. Carl read non-essential and understood the reach. Benches, platform lamps, station signs, and even some old signals that served more to reassure than to meet a rule, and that were now seen as cost. The moral of his work did not disappear, but it was pushed into a corner. Safety for freight and for the timetable. Less for people with suitcases and paper tickets. Less for those who depended on a small stop. On June 7th, he went to a point near Albany to check a set of newly installed relays. The landscape was green, fields and silos, and the air smelled of cut grass, with fine dust kicked up by trucks on the road. On the way back, they stopped at a roadside diner with a worn counter and coffee served in thick mugs. A man in a farm cap remarked aloud that trains now are only good for timber and for war, and no one answered. Carl stirred his coffee with a spoon and looked out the window toward the line in the distance, a dark strip in the middle of green. It was not a romantic line. It was a line of work, of noise, of risk, and of decisions not made there. The moral catalyst came in a place too small to appear on large maps. On June 16, 1967, on a morning of low sky, Carl and Danny were called to a crossing near Harrisburg, Oregon, where drivers complained that the gate closed too early because of a sensitive approach circuit. The order was to adjust it to reduce closure time without compromising safety. Carl knew how to do it. Calibrate the circuit to detect the nearest train, adjust resistances, test with an approaching locomotive, measure warning time with a stopwatch, and record it in the notebook, as was done when you wanted to prove the work had been done. The supervisor on the phone was clear. Less complaining, less delay. Carl wrote everything down in the notebook in small, firm handwriting, including date, location, and the reason for the call. They worked carefully, but the pressure was there in the tone and in the deadline. Danny suggested a more aggressive adjustment, citing guidance he had heard from another crew. Carl refused with a shake of his head and kept the adjustment conservative, within what he considered margin. Even so, the circuit ended up tighter than before. They tested twice with a short switching train. It worked. The red light came on, the bell rang, the gate went down and up, and the mechanism seemed to obey the paper. The paper said it was within standard, and the standard was what the company used to protect itself. That same afternoon, as they put away tools, a yellow school bus appeared on the dirt road, raising dust. It was the end of the school year, children going home, and the vehicle had the ordinary look of a school fleet, paint marked by use. The bus stopped before the tracks, as the rule required, and the driver looked both ways. The signal was green for the road, gate raised. Carl fell to tightening, because he knew not every train gave enough advance warning if the circuit was at the limit, and because at that crossing the line made a gentle curve behind a small stand of trees, reducing visibility. No train was visible. The bus began to cross. The train came from a hidden side, a freight longer than the test trains, coming down at timetable speed. The circuit detected it, but the difference between adequate and slack became an interval of seconds no one could hold in their hands. The red light began to flash, and the bell rang when the bus already had its front wheels over the second rail. The gate came down and struck the side of the vehicle, a light blow, more warning than barrier. The driver accelerated instinctively. The train horns sounded, a note that cut across the fields and seemed to stop the air, and the echo hung for an instant in the trees. The impact was not the kind of full collision seen in films. It was a scrape along the rear of the bus as it nearly completed the crossing. The rear side was crushed and a window blew out. The bus spun slightly and stopped clear of the line, but the train carried with it the sound of metal grinding and glass falling, and the ballast trembled underfoot. For a few seconds, there were no screams. There was a strange silence, as if the world needed to confirm that it had happened, and as if the body took time to understand what the eyes had already seen. Carl ran, his boots sinking into the gravel. Danny followed. The bus driver was pale, shaking but standing. 2 children had been thrown against the seats. One was bleeding from the face, cut by glass. Another, smaller, held an arm at the wrong angle and made a low sound of pain, repeated without complete words. Dust mixed with the smell of brakes and oil, and there was the metallic heat coming off the train. The train stopped several cars ahead, the locomotive giving off heat, and a railroad employee climbed down running along the ballast, stepping between ties and stones, with the urgency of someone who knows every minute becomes a record. The emergency phone in the signal house was 50 meters away. Carl ran to it and called the dispatcher. His voice came out steady because his body knew how to work even when his mind wanted to stop. He asked for an ambulance. Police reported a partial collision, said there were injuries and children in shock, and gave a location by milepost and point name, as if precision could contain the damage. As he spoke, he saw through the window glass the bus driver sitting on the step, head in hands, and Danny trying to keep the children calm without touching them too much, avoiding making fractures and cuts worse. A very small girl, Carl would later learn her name, Melissa Grant, 6 years old, was awake but far too quiet, eyes fixed on a point that did not answer anyone. She breathed short and fast, as if the air had grown heavy, and that quiet seemed more alarming than crying. The Harrisburg ambulance arrived in less than 20 minutes, but those minutes were long. The rain did not fall, but the sky felt heavy, and the wind carried the smell of earth. A farmer stopped with his pickup and helped move shards of glass out of the way, pushing them carefully beyond the roadway. Police arrived and asked questions. Carl answered in technical terms, because it was the language he had. Approach circuit, warning time, adjustment performed that morning, tests with a short train. The word adjustment took on a weight it had not had before, as if it were a physical thing that could be placed in someone's hand. At Sacred Heart Hospital in Eugene, that same night, June 16, 1967, there was no announcement of death. There was emergency surgery in a waiting room with hard chairs, where parents sat with hands in their laps, not knowing what to do with them, looking at clocks and doors. Melissa Grant remained hospitalized for days, with bruised ribs and an internal injury the doctors called serious but treatable. She would survive, carrying a thin scar near her hairline and a new caution whenever she heard bells. The child with the broken arm left with a cast and instructions. The one bleeding from the face received small stitches and a bandage too large. The irreversible thing for Carl was not a funeral. It was something else, quieter and equally final. At that crossing, a sequence of small decisions had stopped being theory and become real people, and the company, to protect itself, needed to point to a name. The investigation began the next day, June 17, 1967, and took Carl's summer. Southern Pacific sent a signal inspector from the Portland area. The state sent people to measure side angles, distance from the curve, typical freight speeds on that section, and to record crossing conditions, including track geometry and the proximity of the trees. There were tape measure readings, locomotive tests, approach time calculations, and notes on clipboards that would later become reports. Carl was present, hard hat in hand, looking at the same piece of rail as if it were something else now. The inspector asked why the circuit had been adjusted. Carl showed the memorandum and the recorded complaints. There had been no intent to cause harm. There had been a chain of haste, of phone calls and deadlines, and an adjustment that, on paper, stayed within a standard that did not account for a full bus, nor for the difference between a short switching train and a long freight at line speed. In July, the heat came to Eugene in a way that left the air still. Carl kept working because the work did not wait. The freight modernization continued with deadlines and materials, and the same language of capacity and efficiency. But now every terminal box seemed to contain a hidden risk, and every seal seemed like a promise that could fail. He began to test 3 times what he had tested twice before, and to check what he had once accepted as good enough. Danny grew quieter, and at certain moments avoided looking at crossings with buses or children. The supervisor called demanding progress. Carl answered with numbers, but his voice dropped when he spoke of time, as if time had ceased to be only a measure. Passenger stops kept disappearing. On August 5, 1967, Carl passed a small station near Salem where the windows were boarded up. The name sign had been removed, leaving only screw marks and lighter wood where paint had once been. A cat crossed the platform and vanished. The sense of abandonment was not dramatic. It was administrative. Things that did not make money were closed with hammer and nail, and the rest went on, with the sound of freight cars occupying the space that had once held conversation and footsteps, and with the silence of those no longer served. At the end of August, the company installed new signals on a section near Springfield to allow shorter intervals between freights. Carl and Danny worked at night because that was when the line could be blocked for a few minutes with authorization and record, and because daytime traffic allowed no slack. Flashlight beams made yellow circles on the gravel. Mosquitoes were persistent. In the distance, the sound of a locomotive idling seemed like breathing, and the smell of hot oil came and went with the wind. Carl felt he was building a different railroad from the one he had known when he joined in 1952 as an apprentice. Back then, there was still the idea that the line was also a bridge for people. In 1967, the bridge was for freight, and people were a traffic problem at crossings, a variable that appeared as a complaint. In September, the Grant family filed suit and a formal complaint in the county, demanding changes and accountability. It was not the kind of thing Carl read in the newspaper in detail, but his name appeared in an internal document as technician responsible for the adjustment, in language that seemed neutral and therefore cutting. Ruth saw his expression when he came home and did not ask much. She put dinner on the table and let silence be a form of care. Their marriage was made of routines: laundry done, bills paid, quiet conversations. Even so, on some nights Ruth woke to find Carl sitting on the bed, staring into the dark as if listening to a distant bell, and the room felt smaller than before. The company offered a transfer to an internal maintenance section in Portland. Less field work, more shop. The offer came on October 2nd, 1967, justified as operational needs on letterhead and standard language. Carl understood what it was as well. Move a name tied to an accident with no death, but with an injured child and headline risk and reduce exposure. He refused, not out of pride, but because the line in inland Oregon was what he knew how to do, and because leaving would not undo the minute the red light had come on too late, nor erase the entry in the notebook. In November, the rains returned hard. The Willamette River rose, mud swallowed shoulders, and secondary roads filled with holes and puddles that hid stone. Carl drove carefully, hands steady on the wheel, the wipers working without rest. On November 14th, 1967, he returned to the Harrisburg crossing to install a new warning system, more robust, with greater advance time and a heavier gate mechanism, with new components and documented adjustments. The state had demanded immediate changes because of the school bus. The company now accepted the cost without argument, because the cost of not accepting had become clear in reports and legal risk. The day was cold and damp. The fields around were brown and dark green, and the air smelled of rotting leaves and soaked earth. As he worked, Carl saw a bouquet of artificial flowers tied to a post, already faded by rain. There was no plaque, only flowers and a frayed ribbon, placed by someone who needed to mark the spot where the world had almost broken. He did not touch it. He stood still for a few seconds, wrench in hand, as if it were possible to measure the weight of that gesture. Danny, beside him, tightened bolts without speaking, following procedure like someone who does not want to be wrong by even a quarter turn. The new system was tested with a long freight, and the bell rang with slack, the red light flashing with enough lead time for any vehicle to stop calmly. It worked. The technique was correct. What had changed was not only the equipment. It was the space Carl now left, deliberately, between the minimum acceptable and what was truly safe, a space that did not fit well into a memorandum. In December, near Christmas, Carl received a simple card from his mother, still living in Astoria, and another from a co-worker in Medford. Ruth hung lights in the window. On December 24th, 1967, a fine, steady rain fell, and the streets of Coos Bay shone under the streetlights, with trembling reflections on the asphalt. Carl and Ruth went to the neighborhood's small church, not out of fervor, but out of habit. There were families with children, wet coats, the smell of wool and warmed wood. Carl sat in the pew, hands together, looking at the wooden floor. There was no word that resolved it. There was only the fact that the world kept moving, with or without the sense of control a signalman liked to believe he had, and with or without the comfort of thinking paper was enough. In January 1968, the freight modernization entered a final phase on some sections. Trains were longer, the cadence tighter, and the intervals between consists seemed shorter. The old passenger stops were closed or invisible, and what remained were marks on the ground. On February 19th, 1968, Carl passed a platform near Cottage Grove and saw the bench had been removed. Where people had once waited, there was only a rectangle of packed dirt and a post without a lamp, with old wiring cut and capped. The company map, updated, no longer showed that point. It was as if it had never existed, and the absence felt deliberate. The Grant family's case was settled with an agreement and a clause requiring technical changes, and internally the company recorded incident mitigated and corrective actions implemented, in language that closed the matter in the file. For Carl, nothing was mitigated. The irreversible thing was in the file and in the body. A formal suspension came in March 1968, 30 days off the line, without the pickup, without the screwdriver, without the familiar sound of relays clicking in a metal box. His badge was held at the Eugene gatehouse, and he had to sign a paper acknowledging failure of judgment and reducing warning margin. It was not a dismissal, but it was a mark that did not wash off with rain. During that month, he woke at the same hours and had nowhere to go. The Coos Bay kitchen felt small. Ruth left for her job and came back with grocery bags, and the two spoke little because the subject was too large to fit at the table, and because repeating did not change what was already recorded. When the suspension ended, Carl returned with a condition. Any adjustment to an approach circuit at a school crossing would include additional margin and a second recorded verification, with a clear note of warning time and visibility conditions. The rule existed somewhere, but now it had the name of a place and a date, and it carried a weight that did not come from a manual. He kept working, and the work remained necessary. He knew well-adjusted signals prevented tragedies. He also knew orders and deadlines could push decisions to the edge. From that summer 1967 on, he began to write more in the notebook. Not only numbers, but small observations, warning time with slack, impatient drivers, visibility reduced by rain, curve with trees interferes. It was a way to remember that the line had people around it, even when the company spoke only of freight, capacity, and delay. In the spring of 1968, on a clear day in March, Carl and Danny finished a job near Springfield and stood for a few minutes watching a freight train pass, cars loaded with lumber cut at inland mills. The sound was continuous, metallic, and the wind raised by the train moved the grass and carried the smell of resin and dust. There was no platform nearby, no one waiting for a passenger train. The railroad was doing what the era demanded of it: move weight, fulfill contracts, supply distant cities with things no one saw being loaded, and keep the flow unbroken. Carl put away the tools, closed the tailgate, and wiped his hands on the rag he always carried in his pocket. He did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who had learned the size of what he carried, even when no one mentioned it, and who knew his work was invisible until the moment it failed. On June 22, 1968, a year and a few days after the accident, Carl passed through Harrisburg again for a routine inspection. The sky was open, and there was the smell of freshly cut hay. The new warning system worked. The gate came down firmly and rose calmly, and the bell had a rhythm that now seemed longer, safer. The bouquet of artificial flowers was still there, more worn, the ribbon nearly gone. Carl pulled the pickup over for a moment on the shoulder and watched the crossing without getting out. A school bus passed in the distance on another road, a yellow blot between trees, and went on without hurry. Carl kept his hands on the wheel, feeling the sun's warmth on the glass, then started the engine and drove on to the next signal point, because that was what his life had become, a map of places where safety had to be greater than the minimum, even when the minimum was what the paper accepted. The work continued for many years, on wet rails and dry summers, on flashlight nights and foggy mornings. Passenger stops became memory or ruin, and the map grew simpler, with fewer names and fewer waiting points. Even so, at every crossing, in every tested bell, there was an attention that did not come from memoranda, but from one specific day in 1967, from a curve hidden behind trees in an interval of seconds that would never again be only a number. When Carl came home that June afternoon, Ruth had the windows open and the smell of dinner came from the kitchen. He washed his hands, hung his coat, and sat at the table. Outside, somewhere beyond the houses, a train horn sounded in the distance, not as threat or promise, but as part of the fabric of the place. And their life went on with the sobriety of those who had learned to live with what cannot be undone, keeping, day after day, the line lit enough for others to cross. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.